this and more. This morning, what is man? If you're visiting with us, that's what we're asking in this quarter of study. What kind of being is man? And what kind of makeup does he have, does she have? We're talking about human beings, and we've already examined that man is not just a physical being, but there is a part of man that is spiritual. We've examined that man is a rational being, that is, that he can reason. He is an ethical being. He can not only reason, but he can know that there is a right and there is a wrong. He is a social being. He needs other people. She needs other people. We need people. People need people. This morning, since this is the halfway point in the quarter of study, what I'm doing with this lesson, so to speak, is kind of tying everything we've said up to this point together. And then we'll go in the last, 4 lessons that we'll have after this morning or so into some other particular areas of man's being that are, I won't say more problematic, but at least more specific that hopefully will help us. And we'll save that discussion beginning next Sunday morning. But for this morning, what is man? Man is a privileged being. You may say privileged. We think of people of privilege, and we think of maybe their birth in a set of circumstances that allowed them to have, a position in society that others did not. And it was due to simply the fact of who their parents were. And typically, of course, we associate that sort of discussion with socioeconomic factors. This person was born with a silver spoon in his or her mouth, meaning their parents possessed, not just sufficient wealth that all of us do in one form or fashion, but even beyond that, they were born in a position where they had greater opportunities because of the social status, the economic status, maybe of parents or grandparents or other family members that factored into it. Today it's used so very often in a sense of one's racial heritage. And if you've not heard the term white privilege, you've not been listening, at least to the commentators on our current cultural situation in this country or even around the world. And this isn't the time or place really to explore all of that and how much is fact, how much is fiction, what is the Christian response. But the idea is becoming more widespread and more accepted that if an individual is of the Caucasian race or descent, as I survey the crowd, that looks like all of us this morning by and large, then we are automatically put in a position where we have certain advantages that other races do not. And it's even sadly being further inferred that we have biases and we have mindsets that's kind of ingrained within us that makes us treat others unfairly. Now, I reject that outright. And I can get really excited about that if you want me to attack some of that foolish type of thinking that's being promoted in various segments of society, entertainment, education, etc. That's, again, not the purpose of this lesson. When I'm saying man is a privileged being, we're going back to Psalm 8. And you remember in verse 4 the question that was asked by David. I can just kind of imagine him, as it were. Now, I don't know that this is exactly how it transpired because he doesn't say, here's what I was doing when I wrote this. But remember, David is the shepherd boy, or was the shepherd boy in his youth. Of course, he is the giant slayer of Goliath, later to become king. But he spent probably many nights out in the fields. And you can just imagine how beautiful it must have been to watch the sunset and the moon rise and the stars appear on the black velvet of the midnight sky. And so David says, in verse 3 of Psalm 8, he said, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained. We've all been out on a beautiful night to know exactly what he's talking about. And then he says, what is man? When I see all of that, what is man that you're mindful of him, the Son of Man that you visit him? You remember one of the first lessons, maybe the first couple of lessons, we just really put that into perspective. All that David knew about our universe, you could put in, we might say, in a thimble compared to what we know of our universe today. We have peered into the far reaches of our galaxies, and David without the artificial illumination that pollutes the night sky today when we go out. Of course, we have other electrical lights that dim the stars for us. If you've been out far away in the country from all artificial lighting, the greater number of stars you can easily see. Well, David, at most, probably at any place on the planet, at one time you can see about 10,000 stars. That's a rough average. Those who study such things said you can look up on a clear, bright night sky and you can see about 10,000 stars. Well, you'd say, well, that's a lot. Well, that's a lot, but when you compare with what we have discovered by sending satellites and telescopes and other apparatus into space now, the latest figure, and this is subject to grow, but the latest figures say that there are around 16 sextillion stars in our galaxy. That's the number 6, then with 16 zeros behind it, if I'm remembering the figure correctly. It's just an astounding amount of, just an amazing amount of information to try to digest when you see that, and the size and the scope and the vastness. David said, what am I? I'm a speck of dust, if you will. Well, mankind occupies, though, a unique place. Verse 5 of that same chapter, Psalm 8, David said, you, that is God, have made him, that is man. God, you have made man, mankind, humankind, men and women, boys and girls. You have made him a little lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor. You have made him to have dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet. Clear. That's a pretty awesome verse right there. Absolutely, it is. And that deserves some consideration by you if you have not given it as of late. Now, mankind occupies this unique place, not only on our planet, but even our planet in the universe. And that fact is happily affirmed by those who believe in God, which, of course, all of us do, and know that his power is the cause of creation of this universe. Now, do atheists and evolutionists concur that man, they would say homo sapiens, that's the biological technical term for us, would they say we are privileged? Well, this is going to be perhaps of interest to you. For the first 100 years following Charles Darwin's publication of On the Origin of Species, and that is the book that wasn't the first volume or writing to advance the idea of organic physical evolution, that is, evolution from lower life forms to more advanced life forms, but it is the volume that is pointed to as just saying in history, that's the watershed tipping point moment when this idea became more mainstream and it took off from there. And so that was published November the 24th, 1859. And proponents of the theory of evolution then began to use such phrases as men, human beings, we are nothing more than hairless apes. That was a popular way to describe mankind. And some people have more hair than others. I'm one of those hairless apes. It's easy to see, but we are just like them. We, instead of hunching over and dragging our knuckles, we can stand up a little taller. We can use our hands and our opposable thumbs with a little bit more dexterity than did they. But that's just the result of the advancement of years and mutations and changes and evolutionary history playing out. That's what we are. In fact, George Gaylord Simpson, he was a Harvard paleontologist and apparently liked for cats to lick his ears, if you can see the cat up there on his shoulder. He wrote, man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. Simpson died, I think, in, I want to say 1984, but the bulk of his academic career was in the earlier part of the century, of course. And he was a believer, of course, in evolution, the hook, line, and sinker. He's telling us that, man, we're just here, and it's all an accident. It's all a materialistic process. There's no supernatural intervention from a God or any other force. It's all merely physical. We were not planned, but, aren't we happy, or aren't we just joyed that, lo and behold, how by some means we did arrive? And you remember a couple of lessons ago, we talked about theories and we talked about outlooks on life and perspectives. And one of those perspectives was the idea of fatalism and nihilism and determinism. That is, there's no meaning to anything. There's no purpose. All of it was merely just coincidental or, again, a happy accident that brought us into existence. Now, all of that was said initially. Now, why did that sort of mentality prevail? Well, it had to prevail because, again, if it's a physical process, there can't be anything behind that physical process directing it. It just had to be something that occurred, and there's no rhyme or reason, there's no design, there's none of that. It just happened. And so there's no purpose greater in mind other than just what happened as it did, and that's all fortune, good luck, and a happy coincidence. Well, God's not involved. Here's what happened, though, and you can see this on your handout. As technology, and technology there is a broad term, I realize, but we're talking about with the aid of computers, computer processing, with the arrival of the space age, which we had only viewed space, of course, from terra firma, looking into the heavens. But as we were able to actually go and leave Earth and look at Earth from a totally different perspective, and not just look at Earth from the perspective of space, but look at space from the perspective of space and our universe that way. Further developments in technology like the electron microscope, we could take glass and light, just like my glasses, amplify the light to let me see better. That's words on a page, but now we can take with an electron microscope, for instance, and not just see at the microscopic level, not just see just the little, pores in your skin like you might do with a magnifying glass, but we can look even deeper at the microbiological level. We were able to look not only into the micro world, but the macro world, as it's called. We can use instruments in healthcare like MRIs and CT scans. All of that rapidly increased, and really all of it has rapidly increased since the close of World War II. And all of us are recipients of that increase in technology. And it's become a part of everyday life. Well, what happened? Objective scientists were forced by the evidence to conclude that the universe as a whole, and mankind in particular, were much more advanced than previously assumed. And they were forced to that. They could not deny that fact. Here's one statement, and I don't have it on the screen, but please listen, and I know it's a lot to digest. This was written by the same groups that produced what were called the humanist manifestos. These are people that say there's no God, man's at the top of the evolutionary chain, we're the top, we're just here, we're happy to be here, we don't know how we got here, there's no reason for us to be here, we don't know where we're going, we're not really going anywhere, but we're here. Well, they write, quote, "Humanism quite willingly admits that man has wider relations which should be studied. He is a part of the universe, and it is impossible to determine the nature of the part until we know something about the character of the whole. Any attempt to determine those relations in the widest possible sense, humanism welcomes. Through the study of our wider environment, we may be forced to change our present opinion concerning ourselves." Now that's a lot of verbiage. What are they really saying? If you boil it down and distill it to its very essence, they're saying the more that we learn, the more that we realize we are here purposefully. They're trying to say, we were wrong. What we previously asserted, that everything was just an accident, there was no evidence of design, there's no indication that there is any meaning in any of it, or any supernatural, or any guidance at all. They still wouldn't say any supernatural guidance. We have to reconsider that because technology is just making it such that it's undeniable. And I could provide you, and if you're interested, I have several volumes in my library that I could happily loan to you to prove this. For instance, when the human genetic code, the human genome as we call it, was finally mapped with the aid of computer processing, your DNA and your RNA and all of your little amino acids, which I'm going back to science class, and that wasn't my best subject in school, although I did enjoy it. The information encoded in that, just in one human being, is an astronomical amount of information. Adrian and I, we shared, and I should have put that on screen now that I'm thinking about it. Of course, studying psychology, his study is somewhat linked to the study of the brain. And there's an MRI image that scientists were just able to take in the last, I guess it was published in the last few months, using the newest high-powered microscope that's available with technology. They took one cell of a mouse that was the size of a grain of sand. Just to give you a point of reference, that's the best they said that they could compare it to, so that we could easily conceptualize what they're talking about. But one cell, the size of a grain of sand in the brain of a mouse, has over 1 billion different connective synapses. You know, your synapses are the little receptors that just send all throughout your brain that control your movements, your mood, and everything else. In a mouse, the grain of sand, that small, over 1 billion different of these connections. Guess how many you have in your brain? Yeah, that number's too large even to pinpoint, but they took a picture of what that would have looked like and assigned different colors to all of these different connective little electrical brain connections in a mouse, and it was fascinating. Well, what does that prove? That doesn't prove that everything happened accidentally. And what those researchers, and they were atheistic and evolutionary in their perspective, were first to consider, they said, we're more advanced than we thought. Here's the way that one group did put it. And I know some of this you might not think to be of great interest to your life, but if you stop and ponder it, maybe you'll see a little bit more of what I'm trying to say when the study is over. This depth of uncertainty and the qualified endorsement of mankind's privileged position, after all, this is what I didn't say about the last point. If evolution is true, then there has to be some more advanced life form that's waiting to replace even us. That's something they conveniently try to get you not to really think about. For the theory to hold true, though, they must be asserting or assert that that is coming. That is, there's something better than you on the horizon. There's something better than human beings. There's some other thing that we're going to evolve into. And they say, well, it's happening so slowly, maybe in 1 billion years that'll be true. Well, that's a little bit of a cop-out because supposedly we've been, evolving according to their theory for billions of years. Here's what one study by Bruce Lahn, he was the lead professor at the University of Chicago, he published this, and I know this is a lot of just blah, 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 and I'll try to dumb it down for my sake. And if it'll help you, then hopefully that'll be the case at the same time. He said human evolution is in fact a privileged process. There's our word. Because it involves a large number of mutations in a large number of genes to accomplish so much in so little evolutionary time. A few tens of millions of years requires a selective process that is perhaps categorically different from the typical processes of acquiring new biological traits. He's talking about our minds. He said, how is it that the human mind is able to reason and to think, to synthesize information, to talk even as we're doing right now in a coherent way about these things when other life forms, animals, have no conception of these matters, no cognizance or awareness even of themselves in the greater universe, and no desire to learn anything about that? Why is that? How has that happened? And he says, evolution, we realize there's something going on here. Privileged processes, so much happening so little. And here's how he concludes this last part of the study. He said, quote, the making of the large human brain is not just the neurological equivalent of making a large antler. You see, they would say animals evolved, and so deer have antlers. That's just something they evolved over the years for some purpose, and we're still trying to figure out how. Does your brain, did it just evolve like an antler? No, rather it required a level of selection that's unprecedented. Our study offers the first genetic evidence that humans occupy a unique position in the tree of life. Simply put, evolution has been working very hard to produce us humans. You know what he's saying? He's saying evolution doesn't really explain why we are the way we are and the capabilities that we have. But there's no other explanation that I'm willing to entertain, so maybe that's how it did it. We just don't know how. The book that I have referenced before, that's in my library downstairs, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Norman Geisler helped co-write that, and that's what I would simply say in response. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. That is, that there are blind processes that somehow worked. We don't know how. Yes, we're unique. Yes, we're privileged. And yes, their word would be just lucky or fortunate, as it were. And you see how irrational and illogical this is? Now, what they will tell you is that you people who gather in church buildings and talk about a God that you supposedly can't see, while physically verifying Him empirically with our own eyes, we cannot see, but the evidence of what He is and what He does is all around us. But they would say, you believe in a book that talks about a God you can't see or hear. You don't see Him doing any of these things. Your faith is blind. I think we need to turn it back on them and say, but your faith is just as blind, and I would say even more so, and irrational, even at heart. I think we need to make them eat their words, so to speak. Some of you know the political, I guess you could call him strategist, and he's written books, and some of our politicians are following the tenets of his system. His name was Saul Alinsky. Alinsky said about his political opponents, he said, you need to make them eat their words. And what he meant by that was the policies they propose, you need to make them live by themselves. And sometimes the guys in Washington, we wish they would live by the same laws they make for the rest of us. Well, that's kind of what we need to do in this situation. We need to point out that what you're saying, what you're suggesting, is much more irrational than what we are proposing. In plain language, this research admits that humanity's cognitive abilities, that is, your ability to think and reason, cannot be explained through the tenets of evolution. That's what he's saying. He's saying we are in a unique position in the tree of life. We have abilities that evolution has granted to us that it's granted to no other creatures on the planet, but it must have. Well, how illogical and irrational is that? They cannot give credit to God. They assume that evolution did it. Let's go to the back page. Let's get to some things that are more important for us. Those who fear God can confidently argue that man is privileged, that is, in an unqualified manner, due to having been supernaturally created in the image of God. How can that position be observed? Well, I'm just dividing it into two areas, and we've done this already before. Man is privileged physically, and man is privileged spiritually. Now, man is privileged physically. You love your puppy dog or your kitty cat or your combination of both and other creatures, and we know that those animals possess physical traits and physical life. And as human beings, we are not the biggest, fastest, or strongest creatures on earth. We have domesticated some, and we enjoy that. And yet God said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion, that is, authority over, have control over, as it were, fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And we are able to do that. And why are we able to do that? By and large, yes, there are still animals that we have not kind of controlled, as it were, and even those that we sometimes have tamed, sometimes don't always act in accordance with that taming. You know, every time one of these guys gets in a cage with a lion or a tiger, and the tiger or the lion eats him, we say, well, I can't believe that happened. Well, I can. You know, he got in the cage with a wild animal. Well, we do that. We have that capability to exercise dominion, not because of our brawn, not because of our strength, but because of our brain. Notice there, and this has been a question that's been asked before by some of you, how do we explain animal behavior? Well, animals operate on instinct. That is, the pattern of behavior based on stimuli. Now, that simply is saying what we observe biologically, and it's true that there are even instincts within human beings. There are drives within us. There is in your stomach a little receptor that when there's not adequate nutrition, it sends a little message up to your brain and it says, I'm hungry, put something in here. There are other types of instincts and things that even we possess, but animals operate on that basis. However, humans base their actions on reason. Reason includes the ability to learn, evaluate, and synthesize data in order to make choices and decisions. Now, again, this is not to say that animals are without any spatial abilities. Animals can, it seems, learn in some capacity, in some use of that word. But I would perhaps argue, and this isn't an area of expertise for me either, that it is more a case that it is classical conditioning simply to get a response. And this isn't Pavlov's dog, but if you've ever studied Pavlov, the Russian psychologist, experiment with his dog, he would put a food item out for his dog to eat, and of course his dog would begin to salivate, to just drool, waiting for that little treat. And Pavlov began, every time food was set out, to also ring a little bell. This is the psychological experiment. The dog would begin to drool, the food would be offered, and after just a short period of time, of course, Pavlov observed that the little bell could be rung and the dog would be drooling, waiting for the meal, whether it was there or not. Classical conditioning simply to stimuli. That's different from learning and utilizing reason and regulating behavior. Now, I can only, because of time's sake, look at one way that human beings are physically privileged, and it might not be the way you think. We are physically privileged as human beings in how we can respond to pain. The blessing of pain is great in the human race. I know that sounds contradictory and counterintuitive. You would say, pain's not a good thing, preacher. Arthritis isn't a good thing. Chronic, issues of whatever type they might be. Those things aren't good. I don't like pain. Well, none of us do. And yet it is critical to our well-being, which may sound absurd. Pain warns of danger, but pain can also be used for additional productive purposes. Pain and suffering can produce bitterness or other adverse outcomes, but pain can also create empathy, perseverance, and other positive attributes. Here's the way one author, Harold Kushner, he is an Orthodox Jewish writer. I don't agree certainly with his theology, and I don't even agree with the conclusion he makes in his book that this comes from, about how God is impotent to take care of pain. But this statement, I believe, is nevertheless true. He said, we may not ever, that's instead of many, we may not ever understand why we suffer or be able to control the forces that cause our suffering, but we can have a lot to say about what the suffering does to us and what sort of people we become because of it. Pain makes some people bitter and envious. It makes others sensitive and compassionate. It is the result, not the cause of pain, that makes some experiences of pain meaningful and others empty and destructive. And I believe that's right. In fact, if you notice there on your handout, that's exactly what 2 Corinthians 1 verse 3 and 4 tells us. Paul says we are blessed by God and comforted by God when we are in trouble, when we are hurting. With the understanding then that verse 4, Paul says, so that we may be able to comfort any who are hurting. Your pain at the moment may not just be for your well-being, but may be for, in the future, the well-being of others because of the help and the comfort, the aid that you can get them because of the empathy that your pain produced. James 1, 2-4, not only does pain have a privileged physical response, it even intersects and integrates somehow with our spiritual well-being, where James says, count it all joy when you fall into divers or various trials, when things go against you. Why? Because he says the trying of your faith produces patience or perseverance, endurance. And if we let that have its perfect work, it'll help our faith to mature, to be more genuine. And yes, that relates not only to us physically, but even to the spiritual component of man. So there's an integration into those two ideas. 1 Corinthians 10, 11, and 12. You remember this is the passage where Paul is telling the church at Corinth that they need to be looking at the example that others have set for them, the children of Israel, namely, and learn from it. And then he said, learning from that, in verse 12, let the one who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. The pain of the past, both personally and individually, that's affected my own life, but even the pain of the past and those things that have happened in history should help me understand then, better know how to regulate my own behavior and my own response to God. So man is a privileged position physically, and he's taking all of those things that we've talked about in previous lessons and combining this into that. No other animal has this capability. And when I say animal, I'm not saying man is an animal, but I'm just using the language of those who try to eliminate God from the equation. If you say we're just advanced animals, we differ from them significantly. We are so much, as Genesis 1 says, over them in dominion and in authority. And that is because the privileged position we enjoy, of course, being made in the image of God, naturally. Well, man is not only privileged physically. Here's the last 3 points this morning, and I know you know these, but they always deserve to be mentioned, and they need to be emphasized. Man is privileged spiritually. We have something that other creatures do not, and it's a soul, an eternal soul, or an everlasting soul. It did have a beginning, but it will live forever. This spiritual aspect of humanity, again, made in the image of His Creator, differentiates Him from all other creatures. It's what, if you will, and allow me to use language like this, it is what makes specks of dust, which you and I are, more than specks of dust. And it explains the question that we ask in the beginning from Psalm 8, verse 4. What is man that you're mindful of him and that you visit him? That question is answered when I realize that I'm made in the image of my Creator. 3 distinct blessings, then, that God has supplied to man in the spiritual realm illustrates mankind's privileged position. And I would argue further, and in fact at the worship hour we're going to do this, the lack of human flourishing or satisfaction or joy or whatever you want to call it that we see in the world today, the frustrations, the disappointments, the continual, conflict between people and even within each of us individually in our own lives is our lack of understanding of this part of man that we must supply, or this part of our being that we must give attention to, and that's the spiritual part. That is, that there is if you will, one of the ancient authors said there's a God-shaped hole within every person. Now think about that. That's kind of an abstract thought, I realize, but there's a God-shaped hole. Now what shape does God take? He's a spirit. He doesn't have a tangible physical shape, but our language to be accommodative, to help our minds grasp it, there's a God-shaped hole within each of us. And the only thing to fill that hole is God. Well, how does He do that? He offers these things to us, at least these 3, and maybe you could add to them, but maybe they encapsulate all of that. Number 1, man can be the child of God. We can become children of God. What manner of love the Father has bestowed on us that we should be called children of God. John takes that as an assertion, understanding that his readers would have grasped what was necessary for this state to come about. And the gospel tells us what Jesus did to make this a possibility. And when we take advantage of it, what a wonderful opportunity that we can be children of God. Now, the cop-out, if you want to call it that some make, they say, well, if you say God's the Creator and He made everybody, and He did, if God made everyone, then why isn't He the Father of everyone? It's only those who will submit and obey and become His children who can enjoy those accompanying privileges. Yes, God has made everyone. And yes, His invitation to be their Father is available to all. That's one of the sad tenets of certain religious dogmas that say that God is only interested in being the Father to some, or only interested in extending salvation to a select few. That would make God, in my opinion, a terrible God in every way. But that's not the God that we know. It's God's desire that all men be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. Scripture affirms. It was God who so loved the world. There's no one left out that He gave His only begotten Son. Will we respond to Him or not? Well, man can become a child of God. He is privileged spiritually. All dogs don't go to heaven. I know that disappoints some of you, but that's just the reality of the facts. Number 2, man can have a spiritual family. Spiritual brotherhood joins people together. The camaraderie, the companionship, the fellowship, that's the word that we just generally use to talk about that together we have a level of relationship deeper than any familial or social bond. The church is not just a club, if you will. It's not just a loose conglomeration of individuals that just come together and share an interest like some other human organization. It's so much more than that, or at least it's intended to be. Now, unfortunately, and I'm not excluding us here, but I'm just simply pointing out the fact, as it has been everywhere else, I've been everywhere else, those of you that have been other places too know, sometimes we don't live up to this wonderful possibility. We don't take advantage of the relationship we can enjoy with our fellow Christians. We don't offer the help and the meaning in their life and receive it into our own lives like we should. We want to live as little islands to ourselves, so to speak, or we have a family unit, our physical family, and we just kind of keep our spiritual family at arm's length. If we really see in the New Testament the type of one another people we should be and incorporate that into our bonds and relationship through Christ that ties us together, what a wonderful blessing that is. And I'm not saying that never happens. It most certainly does. And so many of you have graciously allowed even myself and my family to integrate into yours that way. And all of us together, we can do that even more and should look for every opportunity to do that. Number 3, man can enjoy the blessing of forgiveness and salvation. Sin plagues the planet. Satan stalks every person, enticing them to sin. That's just, again, the facts. We know that. Satisfaction and joy will never be enjoyed from the physical. That's what we're going to talk about a little bit at the worship hour as well. We've tried it for centuries. And you've tried it in your own life as I've tried it in mine. We've tried to put things in that God hole other than God, and they just don't fit. They just don't fit. And so the only thing that I can put there is God. And what He wants me to fill my life with, of course, is His love. And when I do that, then I am going to do everything He asks me to do, and I'm going to receive everything that He offers me. And at the top of that list is His forgiveness, is His salvation, that position or that state that I was previously estranged from Him. He brings me back into fellowship with Him. And I do that, and you do that. All people do that when they submit to Jesus as their Savior, obey His gospel, and enjoy the peace that He alone provides. Man is a privileged being. We are special, and we are special having been made in the image of God, placed in a special way. I wish I could take time, and this is where I guess the nerd comes out in me. Some of you have heard some of this before, but if you look at what they call the fine-tuning of the universe, it's just astounding. Some of the things that, again, the atheists will say, well, that just happened. Such things as strong and weak nuclear forces. I'm not a physicist. I've read a lot about this, and it still makes my head hurt when I try to think about it on some level, but the way that subatomic particles hold together, and some of you say, I don't even know what a subatomic particle is. I don't know either, but the subatomic particles that hold the universe together, if that force was only just slightly stronger or slightly not as strong, there could be no matter. There couldn't be a wood pulpit. There couldn't be a human body. There couldn't be a tree outside. All of that at a subatomic level is held together by a force that is just right. And you can write a math equation that would fill, I guess, every square inch of this auditorium to try to explain it physically. Or you can say there was someone behind it, someone creating, someone with infinite knowledge and power and love who created it in just this way for those that He loves. And that's our God. And we are those that He does love. Thank you for studying with us this morning. How great is our God. How great is our wonderful appreciation and love for Him who first loved us. We hope you'll come back next week. We'll study another lesson then, the Lord willing.